The Mexican-American war teamster whose wagon train was ambushed, then played dead, while Comanche warriors took his scalp and walked 40 miles to base with his skull showing, was a story my grandfather told me over a bottle of cheap beer in a garage that smelled like sawdust and old oil. And it was the only thing I could think about when the hum of the C-130 finally died, and the heat of the desert hit me like a physical blow to the chest. I was 22 years old, standing on a tarmac that felt like it was melting, and for some reason, the only thing that made sense in the world was the image of that teamster, head stripped bare, walking through the brush with nothing but the instinct to keep moving, one foot in front of the other, because stopping meant you were already part of the dirt. I didn't know then that I was about to walk my own 40 miles, or that the scalp wouldn't be the only thing I'd lose, or that I'd spend the next decade trying to figure out how to put the skin back on a soul that had been flayed raw by things I didn't even have the words to describe yet. Back home in Ohio, life was just a series of mundane certainties that I took for granted like the air I breathed. My town was the kind of place where everyone knew your truck by the sound of the muffler, and my biggest problem was deciding whether to take over my dad's plumbing business or head to the state school to study something I didn't care about. I had a girl named Sarah, with hair the color of wheat and a laugh that made the long, gray winters feel like mid-July, and we spent our nights sitting on the tailgate of my Silverado, staring at the stars and talking about a future that felt as solid and immovable as the Appalachian foothills. I was happy, though I didn't have the sense to know it. I was just alive, moving through the days with a sense of entitlement that only a young man who has never seen anything truly broken can possess. I thought the world was a map you could unfold, read, and master. I didn't realize it was a trap. The decision to enlist didn't come from some grand patriotic awakening or a movie poster desire to save the world. It was a Tuesday, late October, and the wind was stripping the last of the orange leaves off the maples. I was watching my dad work under a sink, his hands gnarled and stained with pipe dope, his back hunched in a way that signaled he had already given his best years to the copper and the PVC. I suddenly realized that if I stayed, I would eventually become him. Not in the good ways, the steady ways, but in the way that he had stopped looking for anything beyond the next job. I wanted to see something else. I wanted to be pushed until I felt like I was made of something harder than bone and gristle. I told Sarah I was doing it for the GI Bill, and she cried, and I felt a smug, youthful sort of pride in the sacrifice, like I was the lead character in a story that hadn't even started yet. I was so incredibly wrong. Boot camp at Parris Island was the first time I realized that my own mind was the biggest threat I had. The humidity was a constant, heavy blanket that made the air feel like soup. And the sand fleas were a biblical plague that never took a break for the Sabbath. I learned to move when I was told, to eat when I was told, and to sleep standing up if necessary. There were guys from all over, a kid from Chicago who had been in trouble with the law, a soft-spoken farm boy from Georgia who talked to his rifle like it was a golden retriever, and a loudmouth from Jersey who could recite the entire script of every action movie ever made. We bonded over the misery. That was the glue. We were all being stripped of our civilian selves, replaced by something functional and hollowed out. I wrote letters to Sarah every night, telling her about the food and the drill instructors, but I never told her about the way I felt when I looked in the mirror, like someone was looking back at me who didn't quite know his own name. By the time I landed in the desert, the reality of what I'd signed up for began to settle in, not as a realization, but as a dull, constant thrum in the base of my neck. We were stationed at a forward operating base that looked like it had been dropped into a sandbox by a bored god. It was all T-walls and concertina wire, the smell of burning trash and jet fuel hanging so thick in the air it tasted like chemicals on your tongue. We slept in plywood shacks that vibrated whenever the heavy artillery went off, and we spent the days cleaning weapons that were already spotless. I met Miller there. Miller was a guy who could find something funny in a funeral, his eyes always darting around with a nervous, manic energy that usually signaled we were in for some kind of trouble. He was the one who told me that if you keep your humor, you keep your humanity, but even then. I saw the way he looked at his photos from home, like he was looking at a ghost. The work was endless, grinding boredom, punctuated by moments of sheer, unadulterated terror. We did patrols, walking through villages that felt like they were watching us, the eyes of the locals tracking us from behind doorways and shuttered windows. My boots were always filled with sand, my skin perpetually coated in a fine layer of grit that worked its way into every pore. We'd walk for hours under a sun that felt like it was trying to kill us, listening to the crinkle of our own gear and the distant, low rumble of generators back at the base. Sometimes we'd stop at a wall and just sit, sharing a canteen, talking about what we'd do when we got back. Not big heroic stuff, just simple things, a cold beer at the local dive, a burger that didn't come out of a pouch, the way the grass felt under your feet when you walked through a park. We were ghosts and we were talking about heaven like it was just a few miles down the road. I remember one patrol in particular, about 3 months in. We were moving through an irrigation canal, the water stagnant and smelling of rot, when the silence suddenly changed. It wasn't that a noise started, it was that the entire world seemed to hold its breath. The birds stopped, the crickets went quiet, and the wind simply gave up. I felt it in my marrow, a cold, static charge that made the hair on my arms stand up. Miller caught my eye, his grin gone, his hand tight on the forestock of his carbine. We were exposed. We were walking targets in a landscape that wanted us gone. I looked at the guy to my left, a kid named Rodriguez who had a picture of his newborn daughter taped to his stock, and I saw he was staring at the same patch of high grass I was. We didn't say a word. We just moved, low and slow, our boots finding the soft, treacherous ground of the canal edge. I thought about the Teamster again, the way he just kept walking even when his skin was hanging off his skull, and I realized that at that moment, I wasn't fighting for freedom or a country or a flag. I was fighting because I didn't want to be the one who stopped walking. The heat was rising, shimmering off the rocks in waves that blurred the horizon. We were miles from the wire, and the radio had been nothing but static for the last hour. Every step felt like a gamble. We reached a fork in the path, one that led toward a cluster of mud brick ruins that looked like they hadn't seen a living soul in centuries. The sergeant signaled a halt. He was a guy who had been there for 3 tours, a man who moved with a terrifying economy of motion. He stood there, his back to us, studying the landscape through his binos, and I felt the weight of my rifle in my hands, a heavy, cold piece of steel that suddenly felt like the only thing keeping me attached to the earth. The air was so dry my nose started to bleed, a thin, bright line of red dripping onto my desert tan uniform. I didn't even wipe it away. I was watching a beetle move across the sand, an iridescent little thing that seemed entirely unbothered by the fact that it was sitting in the middle of a war zone. It was such a small, perfect life, focused on its own survival. And I envied it. I wanted to be that beetle. I wanted to have no concept of what was waiting in the shadows of those ruins. The sergeant lowered his binos and turned, his face unreadable, his eyes fixed on a point just past my left shoulder. He didn't look scared. He looked tired, the kind of tired that sleep doesn't touch. He signaled for us to tighten up, to move in a diamond formation, and I felt the familiar, sickening lurch of adrenaline as I stepped into the dust. We were moving toward the ruins, toward whatever the day had been saving for us. I looked back once at the long, empty track we had left behind, and I felt a sudden, sharp pang of homesickness. Not for Ohio, but for the version of myself that existed before the first time I'd ever heard a shot fired in anger. The ruins came into view, jagged walls of sun-baked mud looming against the cloudless blue. There was a weird, heavy stillness inside the compound, the kind of silence that usually meant something had been disturbed. We drifted in, boots crunching on dry, brittle brush. My heart was hammering against my ribs, a trapped bird trying to break out. Miller was whispering something, a joke about the smell, but it trailed off when we hit the center of the courtyard. We all stopped dead. It wasn't an ambush, at least not the one I was expecting. It was a cache of something that shouldn't have been there, a pile of crates marked with markings I couldn't translate, and sitting right on top of the pile was a single, dusty pair of desert boots. They were worn out at the heels, the laces frayed, exactly like mine. I stared at them, and for a second I couldn't breathe. It was like looking at my own grave. The sergeant moved forward, his hand signaling us to hold, and he started to pry the lid off the crate with his combat knife. The wood groaned, a long, agonizing sound that seemed to echo for miles across the desert floor. I kept my eyes on the ruins, scanning the windows, waiting for the crack of a rifle, waiting for the world to explode, but there was nothing. Just the dry, hot wind whistling through the gaps in the mud walls. I reached down and touched my own boot, feeling the grit inside, and wondered how many miles I had left in me before I ended up like that pair of boots, just another piece of gear left behind in the sand. The lid popped off, a puff of stale, trapped air escaping the crate, and the sergeant shone his light inside. I couldn't see what was in there, but I saw his face. His expression didn't change, but his eyes dimmed like he had just seen something he'd been trying to forget for 20 years. He stood up, his face ashen, and he looked at each of us in turn. There was no order given, no command to fire or move or retreat. He just looked at us, and I knew, with the kind of clarity that only comes when you're staring into the abyss, that we were not going to be the same people when we walked out of this place. The sun was starting to dip lower, painting the desert in long, bruised purples and burnt oranges, and for the first time, I realized that the desert wasn't just a place, it was an ending. The sergeant signaled for us to move toward the far wall, his movements slow, deliberate, like he was walking through water. We followed, our boots kicking up little plumes of dust that hung in the air, glowing in the fading light. We reached the gap in the wall, and as we stepped through, I heard the faint, distant sound of a single rhythmic thump, like a heartbeat or a footstep. I stopped. I couldn't help it. I turned back toward the crates, toward the ruins, toward the silence that was now waiting for us to leave. The others kept moving, their shadows stretching out long and thin in front of them, but I was rooted to the spot, listening to that sound. It was coming from deeper inside the complex, from a part we hadn't cleared yet, a place that felt darker, colder despite the heat. I knew I should keep moving, that the mission was to clear the perimeter and head back to the transport, but the sound was pulling at me, a low, steady thrum that seemed to vibrate in my own chest. I looked at Miller, but he was gone, already around the bend of the wall. I looked at the sergeant, but he was staring at the horizon, his hand resting on the grip of his sidearm. I was alone, standing in the middle of a dead city, listening to the desert breathe. I took one step, then another, my boots silent on the packed dirt. The air was getting cooler, a sharp, metallic tang creeping into the scent of the dust. I rounded the corner of a fallen beam and found myself in a small, windowless room, the walls coated in a thick, fine layer of ash. In the center of the room sat a single wooden chair, facing the wall. It looked like a throne or an altar. I didn't see anyone, but I heard the sound again, a scraping noise like bone on stone. My hand went to my rifle, the safety clicking off, a sound that felt deafening in the tiny space. I stepped closer, my shadow stretching out, long and distorted against the back wall. I held my breath, every muscle in my body coiled, waiting for the movement, waiting for the attack, waiting for the thing that had been waiting for us all along. The air suddenly turned ice cold. I stared at the back of the chair, at the frayed fabric of the seat, and I saw a hand, thin and weathered, gripping the wood. It wasn't moving, it was just waiting. I stepped around to see the face, my heart stopping, the world narrowing down to that single point of focus, and just as my flashlight beam cut through the darkness, I realized the chair was empty. The chair was empty, but the indentation in the cushion was still warm. I stood there, the beam of my light dancing over the coarse fabric and then onto the floor, where a pile of personal effects was laid out with the kind of geometric precision that only a man who has lost everything and is trying to organize his sanity could manage. There were no weapons, just a stack of weathered letters, a photograph of a woman whose face had been scrubbed away by someone's thumb, and a dog tag that wasn't American, resting on a flat, polished stone. The scraping sound hadn't been a person. It had been a loose piece of corrugated tin hanging from the ceiling, caught in the draft, clicking against the mud wall in a rhythm that mimicked a human heartbeat. I stood there for a long time, the silence pressing against my eardrums until they hummed. I felt like a trespasser in a graveyard of memories, and the shame of it was hot and sharp. I had come in here ready to kill, ready to be a hero, and instead, I had found the evidence of a ghost who had lived in this hole for God knows how long, waiting for a war to end that clearly had no intention of stopping. I didn't touch the tags. I didn't touch the letters. I backed out of that room like I was walking away from a crime scene, my breath coming in ragged, shallow hitches. Outside, the light had turned that bruised, electric purple you only see in the desert when the day is gasping its last. The guys were by the transport, their silhouettes framed against the jagged skyline. Miller was sitting on the tailgate, tossing a pebble at a piece of scrap metal, the metallic pinging sound echoing through the compound. He looked up when he saw me, his expression shifting from a vacant stare to a quick lopsided grin, but his eyes stayed guarded, tired. He didn't ask what I'd found, and I didn't tell him. We didn't talk about the things that made our skin crawl. We only talked about the things we could hold, the things we could fix. I climbed up next to him and sat down, the metal of the truck bed cooling rapidly in the twilight. We sat there in the quiet for long, while just watching the stars bleed into existence, bright and indifferent. It was the only time in all those months that the world felt almost still, almost right. I realized then that I wasn't just a soldier. I was a man sitting in the dark with another man who was just as lost as I was, and the weight of that companionship felt more real, more heavy, than the Kevlar vest I was still wearing. The mission orders that had brought us to those ruins were supposed to be a standard recon, a sweep for contraband and intelligence, but by the time we started the engine, everything had shifted. We weren't a unit anymore. We were a collection of nerves and adrenaline, bound together by the knowledge that we had stepped into something that wasn't on the maps. We drove back in silence, the Humvee bucking over the rutted tracks, the headlights cutting through the haze like dim, desperate eyes. Every shadow along the road looked like a threat, every rock a potential trigger. The tension wasn't just a feeling anymore, it was an atmosphere, a pressure that sat on your chest and made it hard to draw a full breath. When we finally saw the perimeter lights of the FOB, the flickering orange glow of the burn pits, I felt a surge of relief so profound it almost made me sick. We were coming back, we were still alive. That was the only scorecard that mattered. But that night, sleep didn't come. I lay on my cot, the plywood walls shivering under the hum of the cooling fans, and I kept seeing that chair. I kept seeing the empty space where a person should have been, the warmth in the cushion, the ghost of a life that had been folded into a crate and left to rot. My mind drifted back to Ohio, to the quiet, predictable life I'd walked away from, and for the first time, it didn't look like a prison. It looked like a dream I'd had a lifetime ago. I thought about Sarah, and I tried to remember the exact sound of her voice, but all I could hear was the metallic clicking of that tin roof. I felt a sudden, violent anger at myself for being there, for wanting to be somewhere else, for being a man who had left home to find something harder and had found exactly that. I wasn't a hero. I was just a kid playing with fire, and I was starting to realize that the heat was going to leave a mark I'd be wearing long after the uniform was gone. The next week was a blur of checkpoint duty and long, agonizing hours in the watchtower, staring out at a landscape that refused to reveal itself. We were on high alert after the intel from the ruins started to circulate, though nobody ever talked about the chair. We talked about the crates, the munitions, the tactical implications. We spoke in the clipped, professional language of men who had been trained to compartmentalize, to turn the messy, brutal parts of the world into manageable data. But under the talk, there was a rot. You could smell it in the way the guys were starting to look at each other, the way the farm boy from Georgia stopped talking to his rifle, the way the kid from Chicago started cleaning his sidearm every hour on the hour, the way Miller's jokes stopped being funny and started sounding like something breaking. We were all carrying the secret of that room, even if we hadn't been the ones to step inside. The air at the FOB had changed. It felt like we were all waiting for the other shoe to drop, for the desert to finally decide what it wanted to do with us. I was sitting in the chow hall on a Tuesday, staring at a tray of gray, overcooked beef when the mortar alarms started screaming. It wasn't the usual drill. It was a high, sustained wail that tore through the base, a sound that bypassed the brain and hit straight in the lizard part of your spine. My fork clattered to the metal table, the sound lost in the sudden, chaotic scramble of men moving toward cover. I didn't think, I just ran. My boots skidded on the grit, the world tilting as I hit the gravel, diving for the bunkers. The first round hit the fuel depot, a dull, concussive thud that knocked the air out of my lungs, followed by the roar of the secondary blast. The heat was instantaneous, a wall of orange fire that lit up the dusk and turned the sky into a furnace. I curled into a ball, my hands over my head, the ground shaking beneath me like it was trying to eject us. Everything I had been feeling. The creeping dread, the strange, quiet sorrow of the ruins, all of it vanished, replaced by the white-hot, singular focus of survival. The air was filled with the sound of metal tearing and the screams of men who had been caught in the open. I looked up, just for a second, and saw a piece of shrapnel arc through the air, glowing red like a dying star, and I just knew that everything had changed. The bunker was crowded. A tangle of limbs and gear and faces I recognized, but couldn't name. Miller was next to me, his face covered in soot, his eyes wide and vacant. He wasn't joking anymore. He was just breathing long, jagged breaths that sounded like gravel in a grinder. We were trapped in a box of concrete, and outside, the world was burning. I felt a strange, detached calm descend over me, the same feeling I had when I looked at that beetle in the sand. It was the calm of a man who realized he was no longer in control of his own timeline. The world was doing to us what it had always planned to do, and all we could do was wait for the end of the sequence. When the shelling finally stopped, the silence that followed was louder than the explosions. It was a heavy, suffocating quiet, broken only by the crackle of flames and the distant, rhythmic pinging of hot metal cooling. We crawled out of the bunker, our movements stiff and deliberate. The landscape had been reshaped. The fuel depot was a skeleton of twisted steel, and the air was thick with the smell of scorched earth and something metallic, something that made the back of my throat itch. I walked toward the blast site, my boots crunching on glass and debris, and I saw things I didn't want to see, shreds of gear, the twisted remains of a Humvee, and the silhouette of a man I'd been playing cards with 2 hours ago. I didn't look too closely. I couldn't. I just kept walking. My eyes fixed on a patch of clear dirt, because if I looked, I knew I wouldn't be able to turn away. I reached the edge of the perimeter, where the smoke was thickest, and I saw Rodriguez. He was sitting on the ground, his back against a T-wall, staring at his hands. He wasn't crying, he was just looking at his hands, which were covered in a fine, dark dust. I walked up to him, the sound of my own footsteps feeling like an intrusion, and I didn't know what to say. There was nothing to say. Words were useless, flimsy little things that had no purchase on the reality of what had just happened. I sat down next to him, and we just sat there, 2 men in the middle of a burning base, neither of us moving, neither of us speaking. I felt the heat from the fires radiating off the walls, stinging my face, but I didn't move away. I wanted to feel it. I wanted to feel something that was real, something that hadn't been turned into an abstraction by the fear and the adrenaline. I looked at Rodriguez's hands, then down at my own, and I saw they were trembling, not from fear, but from a kind of exhaustion that went deeper than muscles or bones. It was the exhaustion of a soul that had been stretched too thin, pulled until it was translucent. The hours that followed were a surreal procession of debris clearing and damage assessment, a mechanical, numbing routine that kept us moving because stopping was not an option. We were machines, performing the tasks we had been programmed for, while underneath, our minds were trying to process the fact that the world we had known this morning was gone. The officers were walking around with clipboards, their faces masks of professional concern, but I didn't see them. I only saw the men who weren't there anymore. I saw the empty bunks in the barracks, the abandoned gear, the little meaningless things that were now relics, a half-finished crossword puzzle, a coffee mug with a chipped rim, a letter waiting to be mailed. I felt a crushing sense of guilt, a sharp, cold iron spike driven through my chest. Why them and not me? What had I done to deserve to be standing here, brushing the dust off my uniform when they were in bags in the back of a truck? That night, the camp was locked down and we were confined to our quarters. I sat on my cot, the darkness thick and absolute. I could hear Miller sobbing in the next bunk over, a quiet, broken sound that he was trying to hide, but the plywood walls were too thin. I didn't offer comfort. I didn't tell him it was okay. How could it be everything was broken? I reached into my pocket and pulled out the photo of Sarah I'd kept in my wallet, the edges frayed, the color fading in the harsh desert light. I looked at her face, at the girl who was waiting for me back in Ohio, and I felt a sudden, sharp panic. Did she even know who I was anymore? Could she even recognize the man who was sitting in the dark, his hands still trembling, his heart hardened into something that felt like stone? I was a ghost. I had been a ghost since the moment I stepped onto that melting tarmac, and the war was just making it official. I didn't sleep. I just watched the ceiling, the shadows of the vents moving in the moonlight. I thought about the Teamster, the one my grandfather had told me about, the one who had walked 40 miles with his skull laid bare. I finally understood why he hadn't stopped. It wasn't because he was brave. It wasn't because he was a patriot. It was because he knew that if he stopped, if he let himself feel the pain, if he let himself stop walking, he would never be able to get back up. He was just walking to keep the memory of himself alive, one agonizing step after another. I was doing the same thing. I was just walking, keeping the rhythm, waiting for the moment when I could stop and be someone else, or be no one at all. I wondered if he had ever made it home, or if he had just wandered into the brush and vanished, a legend for men in garages to talk about over cheap beer while their own lives ground slowly to a halt. By dawn, the base was stirring again, the hum of the generators returning, the routine of the morning standing up like a house of cards. I went to the wash station, splashed cold water on my face, and looked in the mirror. I didn't recognize the guy staring back. His eyes were flat, his skin was gaunt, and there was a line of tension around his mouth that hadn't been there a few months ago. I was 22, but I felt ancient, 100 years old, carrying the weight of everything I'd seen in the fibers of my clothes and the lines of my face. I stepped out into the light, the sun already burning the horizon, and I joined the queue for the morning formation. We stood in rows, our rifles held at port arms, our faces blank, our bodies stiff. The sergeant walked down the line, checking gear, his eyes moving over us like he was reading a list of inventory. When he stopped in front of me, he didn't say a word. He just looked at me, a long, steady gaze that told me he knew exactly what was happening behind my eyes. We went on patrol that afternoon. It was the same routine, the same heat, the same dry, shimmering horizon, but the rhythm was off. We weren't a unit. We were a ghost ship, moving through a landscape that didn't care if we existed. I walked in the point position, my eyes scanning the ground, my body tuned to the vibrations of the earth. Every crack, every shadow, every movement of the wind felt like a signal. I was waiting for the next hit, for the next explosion, for the next moment when the world would tear itself apart and leave us standing in the wreckage. I was in a state of hypervigilance so profound that I could hear the shift of sand under my own feet, the rustle of my gear, the erratic beating of my own heart. I was so attuned to the danger that I almost didn't hear the voice. It wasn't a call, it was a whisper, a faint, dry sound coming from a cluster of rocks off to the left. I signaled a halt, my hand snapping up, and we froze. The world went silent again, that heavy, thick quiet that precedes the violence. I crouched. My rifle shouldered, my finger hovering just over the trigger. I scanned the rocks, my eyes darting, my mind searching for the pattern, the silhouette, the mistake that would give them away. Miller was behind me, his hand on my shoulder, his breathing steady, rhythmic. We were in the killing zone, exposed, the ground open and flat. I felt the sweat trickling down my spine, the heat of the day pressing into my armor. I saw a movement. A slight flicker of color, the pale green of a shroud behind a jagged outcrop. It was subtle, barely there, a ghost of a shape in the heat haze. I didn't fire. I waited. I watched, my heart hammering, my mind racing through the calculations, range, wind, the angle of the sun. The figure moved again, emerging from the shadows. It wasn't a soldier. It wasn't an insurgent. It was a child, no older than 10, holding a small, rusted tin can. He walked with a limp, his gait broken, his eyes fixed on the ground. He didn't look at us. He didn't seem to care that we were there, a group of armed men ready to end his life if he took one wrong step. He just walked, his path taking him straight through the center of our formation. I lowered my rifle, my arms shaking, the adrenaline slowly leaching out of me, leaving me feeling hollowed out empty. I watched him go, the kid in the desert, alone, broken, carrying a tin can in a place that should have killed him 100 times over. He was a survivor. Just like us. He was a piece of the wreckage that was still moving, still walking, still existing in a world that had forgotten what it meant to be human. We let him pass. I don't know why. We were supposed to stop him, to clear the area, to ensure the security of the patrol, but something in me just couldn't do it. I watched him disappear into the shimmering heat, a small, dark speck against the vast, indifferent sand. Miller watched him too, his expression unreadable. When he was gone, we didn't say a word. We just stood there, the desert wind blowing through us, pulling at our uniforms, trying to dissolve us into the grit. I felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to scream, to run, to throw down my gear and just walk into the desert until I found the edge of the world, but I stayed. I stood my ground, my feet planted in the sand, my rifle heavy in my grip. I was a Marine. I was a soldier. I was a part of this, and I was going to finish the patrol, no matter what it cost me, no matter how much of myself I had to leave behind in the dust. The flight back to the FOB was a nightmare of silence. We were in the back of a truck, the canvas sides flapping in the wind, the engine drone vibrating through our teeth. I stared at the floor, at the scuffs on my boots, at the fine layer of sand that was coating everything. I was thinking about the kid, about the chair in the ruins, about the mortar blast. I was trying to piece it all together, to find a narrative, a thread, a meaning to it all, but there was nothing. It was just a series of events, a sequence of fractures in the fabric of the world, and I was just one more crack. I felt a desperate, clawing need to be anywhere else, in the kitchen in Ohio, smelling the coffee in the rain, listening to my dad talk about the pipes, hearing Sarah laugh. I wanted the normal back. I wanted the certainty of a life that had a plan, a trajectory, a beginning and an end. But that life was gone. It had been erased by the heat and the sand and the things I'd seen. That night was the worst. I sat in the dark, the sounds of the base echoing around me, the distant calls, the machinery, the low murmur of men trying to sleep. I felt a crushing, suffocating weight, a pressure so intense it felt like the walls were closing in, the plywood folding down on top of me. I wanted to reach out, to grab someone, to talk, to say something that would break the silence, but there was nobody. We were all islands, floating in the same dark, radioactive ocean, each of us carrying our own ghost. I pulled out my dog tags, the metal cool against my skin, and I held them tight, the weight of them a reminder of who I was supposed to be. I wasn't just a man in the desert. I was a part of the machine. I was an asset. I was a tool. I was everything I had signed up to be, and I hated it. I hated the uniform. I hated the rifle. I hated the sand that had worked its way into my soul. Miller sat up in the bunk across from me, his eyes catching the light from the moon through the slats. He looked at me, a long, steady look, and then he reached out, his hand resting on the edge of my cot. He didn't say anything, but the gesture was enough. It was a bridge, a tiny, fragile connection in the middle of a war zone. We were two broken things trying to hold each other together. He leaned forward, his voice a whisper that barely reached me, a sound that seemed to come from a long way off. He told me about his home, about the smell of the pine trees in the spring, about the way the light hit the lake in the morning. He talked for an hour, his voice low and steady, painting a picture of a world that felt like it had never existed, a beautiful, impossible dream. I listened, my eyes closed, my heart aching, and for a few minutes the war was gone. It was just us, and the memories of a life that was waiting for us on the other side of the fire. But the morning always came. The mortar alarms would scream, the patrols would go out, the heat would rise. We were living in a loop, a repeating cycle of horror and boredom, and it was wearing us down, eroding our resolve, sanding away the edges of our personalities until there was nothing left but the function. We were being forged, but not in the way I'd expected. We weren't becoming heroes. We were becoming hollow. We were becoming the desert. I looked at the men around me, at the hollowed-out faces, the 1,000-yard stares, the way they moved when they thought no one was watching, and I saw the truth. We were already gone. The men who had left Ohio were dead, left behind in the mud, in the ruins, in the fires, and what was walking around in our bodies was something else, something that had been shaped by the heat and the iron and the silence. The end of the tour was the strangest part of all. It wasn't a sudden, cinematic conclusion. It was a slow, agonizing fade-out, a series of days that stretched into weeks, each one exactly like the one before. We spent the time cleaning our gear, signing forms, listening to briefings about how to transition back to civilian life. They talked about jobs and education and readjustment, using words that had no meaning, no weight, no relevance to the world we had just crawled out of. We sat in the chairs, our backs straight, our faces blank, and we listened to the voices of men who had no idea what they were talking about. I was thinking about the kid with the tin can, about the chair in the ruins, about the mortar blast. I was trying to figure out how to put all of that into a resume, how to explain that I had been to the end of the world and come back with nothing but a set of boots that were worn down at the heels. When we finally boarded the plane, I didn't feel relief. I felt a sense of vertigo, as if the ground was falling out from under me. The cabin was filled with the sound of guys laughing, loud, boisterous, forced laughter that had the edge of a scream. I sat by the window, watching the desert recede, the landscape turning from brown to blue, from sand to ocean. I was leaving, but I was also staying. A part of me was always going to be there, in the ruins, in the sand, in the bunker, waiting for the alarm to sound, waiting for the next patrol, waiting for the world to break. I closed my eyes, the roar of the engines filling my head, and I saw the chair again. It was still empty. It was always going to be empty, and I was going to have to spend the rest of my life walking toward it, even if I never reached the room again. The landing was a blur of noise and light and the smell of fuel. When we stepped onto the tarmac, the air felt different, thick, humid smelling of asphalt and exhaust. It was American air. It was the air of home, but it felt wrong. It felt like I was breathing into a vacuum. I walked toward the terminal, my duffel bag heavy on my shoulder, the gear I had carried for years feeling like a permanent part of my anatomy. I saw the faces of the people waiting, the families, the friends, the smiles, the tears, and I felt a cold, sharp barrier between them and me. They were real. I was a projection, a ghost, a thing that had survived and was now trying to pass as a human. I walked past them, my eyes down, my focus on the floor, because I knew that if I looked at them, if I saw the love and the hope and the innocence in their eyes, I would lose the last thread of myself. I walked out to the parking lot, the night air hitting me like a physical blow. I stood there, the sound of the airport swirling around me, the cars and the lights and the noise. I was back, I was in America, and for the first time I was truly, completely afraid. Not of the war, not of the explosions, not of the desert. I was afraid of the quiet. I was afraid of the expectation. I was afraid of the person I was supposed to be when I walked through that front door in Ohio. I dropped my bag on the pavement, the sound sharp and final. I was still standing, but the ground felt like it was shifting. The sky was too big, the lights were too bright, and the space between me and everything else was too wide to ever close. I looked up at the stars, the same stars that had watched us in the desert, and I realized they weren't the same. They were cold, distant, and utterly indifferent to the fact that I had survived. I stood there, the only man in a sea of people, and I waited for someone, something to tell me what to do next. But nobody came. I was alone. And the silence was waiting for me. I kept standing there in the parking lot until the dew started to settle on the metal of my duffel bag, turning the dust into a dark, gritty paste. My mom was supposed to be at the arrival's gate, but I had ducked out the side exit, needing that extra 10 minutes of being a ghost before I had to be a son again. When I finally pulled into the driveway, the house looked smaller than I remembered. Like the whole neighborhood had shrunk while I was gone. The yellow porch light was burning, casting that soft, amber glow that I'd stared at in my mind 1,000 times when the nights in the desert got too heavy to hold. I sat in the truck for a long time, watching the moths circle the bulb, wondering if I could actually reach for the door handle and step into a life that didn't involve checking the perimeter for tripwires. Walking into that kitchen felt like moving through deep water. Everything was exactly where it had been. The coffee pot with the crack in the base, the stack of mail on the counter, the smell of pine sol and laundry detergent. My mother looked up from the table, and for a second her face froze like she was afraid the person standing in the doorway wasn't actually me. Then she was there, her arms around me, her voice breaking on my name, but I couldn't lean into it. I felt stiff, a stranger in my own skin. My body still locked in a defensive crouch that made her hug feel like an intrusion. I sat at that kitchen table for 3 hours, eating a plate of pot roast that tasted like ash, listening to her talk about the neighbors and the weather. I nodded and smiled in all the right places, but I wasn't there. I was still back in that bunker, watching the dust settle on Rodriguez's hands. The first night in my old bedroom was worse. I didn't turn the lights off for a long time, watching the way the shadows played across the ceiling, waiting for the sound of a mortar alarm that I knew wasn't coming. When I finally drifted off, I didn't sleep. I just sank into a place where the air was always thick with the smell of sulfur and the ground was always trembling. I woke up at 3 in the morning, my heart hammering against my ribs, my hand reaching for a rifle that wasn't there. I sat on the edge of the bed, the silence of the house pressing into my ears until I thought my head would split. I went downstairs, the floorboards creaking under my weight, and stood in the dark kitchen. I drank a glass of water, the cold glass biting into my palm, trying to find some anchor, something that proved I was standing on solid ground and not on the edge of a grave. It was like that for months. I'd be at the grocery store buying milk, and the sound of a cart squealing against the tile would drop me to my knees before my brain could even register what was happening. People would walk past, their faces blurred and distant, and I'd feel like I was watching a movie in a language I didn't speak. I tried to talk to Sarah once, a few weeks after I got back. We were sitting in my car by the lake, the water black and flat under the moon. I started to tell her about the ruins, about the chair and the cold stone and the way the tin clicked, but as I spoke, I saw her eyes widen, that look of soft, terrified pity that cut worse than a blade. I stopped mid-sentence. I realized then that I couldn't tell them. I couldn't drop this weight onto them. It was too heavy, too jagged, too real. So I smiled and said I was just tired, and I drove her home in silence. I started going to the VA office in a town 2 counties over, mostly because I didn't want to run into anyone I knew. The waiting room was always dim, smelling of stale coffee and industrial cleaner, filled with men who had the same look in their eyes, that flat, hollowed-out stare that said they were still somewhere else, fighting a war that had ended for everyone but them. I sat in a plastic chair, listening to the hum of the fluorescent lights, and for the first time I felt a kind of peace. Not the peace of being happy, but the peace of being understood. I didn't have to explain. I didn't have to act. I just had to be in the room, breathing the same tired air as the other men who had seen the things that couldn't be named. We didn't talk much, just nodded, a silent acknowledgement of the hole that had been carved out of our lives. There were days when the anger would come, a hot, violent surge that made me want to smash the world apart, to break every fragile thing I saw because none of it knew how lucky it was to be safe. I'd find myself gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white, driving down the highway without a destination, just pushing the engine until it whined, trying to outrun the memory of that kid with the tin can. But the anger never lasted. It would burn itself out, leaving me exhausted, sitting on the side of the road in the pouring rain, watching the wipers beat against the glass in a rhythm that sounded like a funeral drum. I learned to manage it, to keep it in a small, locked box in the back of my mind, alongside the letters I never mailed and the photo of the woman I didn't know. I'm working at a warehouse now, moving crates of parts from one side of the floor to the other. It's hard, physical work. The kind that leaves my muscles aching and my mind blank, which is exactly what I need. Sometimes, when the sun hits the corrugated metal of the warehouse roof in just the right way, I catch a flash of light that reminds me of the desert, and my heart skips a beat. I stop, my hand frozen on a pallet, and I wait for the air to steady. I don't panic anymore. I just breathe in and out, feeling the solid, heavy weight of the floor under my boots, reminding myself that I'm here, in Ohio, in the light, and that the war is just a story I tell myself in the dark. I still have hope, even if it looks different now. It isn't the hope of a kid who thinks the world is fair or that he can fix everything by just being brave. It's a smaller, quieter thing. It's the hope that one day, the chair in the ruins won't be the first thing I see when I wake up. It's the hope that I can look at a sunset without thinking about burn pits. It's the hope that maybe, if I keep walking, if I keep putting one foot in front of the other, the distance between who I was and who I am will eventually shrink until it doesn't matter anymore. It's the hope that I can be a man who lives in the world, instead of just a ghost haunting the edges of it. Last night, I went for a walk after the house was quiet. The air was cool, smelling of damp leaves and the turning season, a sharp contrast to the dry, burning heat that used to be my entire life. I walked down to the creek, the water rushing over the stones with a sound that felt clean and real. I sat on a log, the wood damp against my jeans, and I watched the reflection of the stars in the water. I thought about Miller and Rodriguez and all the others, and I realized that I wasn't carrying them anymore. I was carrying their memory, and that was a different thing entirely. It was a weight, yes, but it was also a connection, a way to keep them present in a world that had moved on without them. I sat there for an hour, just listening to the woods, feeling the rhythm of the life around me, the crickets, the wind, the slow, steady heartbeat of the earth. I didn't feel broken. I felt worn, like a tool that had been used for something it wasn't designed for, but was still doing the job. I had survived, and that wasn't a punishment. It was an opportunity. I had a life to live, a set of hands to use, a heart that was still beating even when I didn't want it to. I stood up, the dampness seeping into my clothes, and I walked back toward the house. The lights were off, the neighborhood was dark and peaceful, and for the first time in years. I didn't check the perimeter. I didn't scan the shadows for movement. I just walked, my head up, my eyes fixed on the front door, feeling the weight of the night settle comfortably on my shoulders. I still see it sometimes when the light is low and the room is quiet, the empty chair, the photograph, the polished stone, but it doesn't terrify me anymore. It's just a piece of the history, a relic of a time when the world was made of fire and sand. I know what I saw, and I know what I did, and I know that I'm still standing. That's the truth of it, the only thing that matters, the bedrock under everything else. I walked into the house, the lock clicking behind me with a sound of finality. I climbed the stairs, the wood groaning under my feet, and I went to my room. I didn't turn on the lights. I just laid down, the sheets cool against my skin, and I closed my eyes, waiting for sleep to come. I wasn't waiting for anything else. I was just there and the world was quiet and that was enough. The hardest part about coming home isn't the war you leave behind, but the person you realize you have to become to survive the peace.